Welcome to Shattered Ties, where trust is broken, loyalties are tested, and hidden betrayals come to light. Here, we uncover the darkest sides of family, friendship, and love, stories of deception, greed, revenge, and the quiet pursuit of justice. So sit back, listen closely, and step into a world where every shattered bond leaves a scar. 3 years is long enough to believe. The worst is behind you. Not healed, Evan Parker had no illusions about healed. 17 years of marriage didn't dissolve into something you got over, they dissolved into something you learned to carry differently, redistributed the weight, found new arrangements for the load, so you could still move forward. He'd done that, slowly, imperfectly, with the specific unglamorous effort of a man who had 2 kids who needed him to function and therefore had no choice. But to function, he'd done it. The contracting business was stable. His apartment in Glenview was small but his. He coached his son Tyler's baseball team on Saturdays. His daughter Emma called him every Sunday night, without him having to ask. 3 years. He'd made it 3 years. He drove to his parents' house on Christmas Eve thinking, this might actually be okay. He should have trusted the part of him that hesitated in the driveway for a moment before going inside. He'd learned to trust that part of himself too late. His parents' house in Naperville had been the fixed point of his entire geography, the place that had been there before everything else and had remained through everything else, the constant in the equation of his family's life. Same house for 31 years, same Christmas wreath on the door, same smell when you walked in, his mother's cooking, pine from the tree, something warm and familiar that he'd never been able to name precisely, but that had always meant, you are safe here. He stood in the doorway and felt it. The smell, the warmth. He let himself feel it for a moment. Then he went inside. The family was assembled in the living room. His parents, Frank and Linda Parker, both in their late 60s, both wearing the specific expression of people who were very glad to see him, and perhaps slightly more glad than the occasion entirely warranted. His cousin Greg and his wife, his aunt Patricia, his uncle Dennis, and at the far end of the couch, half turned toward the fireplace, his younger brother Jake. Jake Parker was 41, 3 years younger than Evan, 6 inches shorter, and had spent the better part of those 3 years becoming the person their parents called first with news, good or bad, not because Evan was unavailable, but because the divorce had rearranged certain family geometries in ways nobody had fully acknowledged. Jake looked up when Evan came in. He smiled. The smile was warm, which it always was. Jake had always been warm, had always been the one who filled a room with easy energy, the social intelligence that Evan had never quite had, and had never particularly wanted. Until moments like these, when he noticed its absence in himself. There he is, Jake said. Merry Christmas, man. They hugged. The hug of brothers, brief, solid. The physical shorthand of people who shared a childhood and had learned to compress their feelings about each other into a few seconds of contact. Evan got a drink. He talked to his uncle. He helped his mother carry things from the kitchen. The evening assembled itself into the comfortable shape of a family Christmas. Familiar rhythms, familiar voices, the particular warmth of people who had been gathering in this house for decades and knew how to do it. He thought, this is good. He thought, I'm glad I came. Dinner was his mother's roast, the same one every year, the recipe she'd gotten from her own mother and had never written down, because writing it down would have implied it could exist anywhere else. They ate. The conversation moved through its usual channels, work, the kids, the neighborhood, a brief detour into family news that landed and passed without incident. Evan talked about Tyler's baseball, about Emma's semester abroad next fall, about a commercial project in the western suburbs. That was the most interesting work he'd had in 2 years. He noticed, at some point during the meal, that his mother was quieter than usual. Not absent, she was present. She was serving, she was asking questions, but there was something slightly managed about her energy, the way a person is managed when they're navigating towards something they've decided to navigate toward. After dinner, rather than during it, he noted this. He filed it under probably nothing. Jake stood up when the dessert plates were being cleared. He tapped his champagne glass with a spoon, the gesture of someone calling a room to attention, and the conversation settled in the way conversations settled when Jake made gestures like that, which was immediately and completely because Jake had always commanded rooms without appearing to try. I have an announcement, he said. He was smiling, the full smile, the one that had charmed his way through 4 decades of being Jake Parker, the one that made people feel included in whatever was happening. I've been keeping something from you guys for a little while, he said, and I'm really glad we're all together tonight, because I wanted everyone to hear it at once. He turned toward the doorway. Evan looked at the doorway. There was a pause, a held beat, theatrical, the pause of someone who understood the architecture of a reveal and was using it. Then she walked in. She was wearing a red dress. Her hair was the same, the way she moved through a doorway, that particular quality of entering a room, as though the room had been waiting for her, was the same. Everything was the same. Melissa. Evan's brain performed several operations, simultaneously and in the wrong order. First recognition, which was instantaneous, and whole bodies, then context, which arrived a half-second later, like a translation, lagging behind the original, then meaning, which took longer still, because meaning required the previous two to make sense, and they weren't making sense. Melissa, in his parents' living room, standing next to Jake, who had his hand at the small of her back, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. She was wearing a ring. That was not the ring he had given her. Everyone, Jake said, I'd like you to meet my fiancé. The room applauded. He heard it from somewhere, slightly outside himself. The clapping, his mother's sound, someone saying congratulations, his uncle's voice, the general warm noise of a room full of people responding to happy news. Evan didn't clap. He wasn't sure his hands were working. He was looking at Melissa. She was looking at him. Her expression was composed, carefully, deliberately composed. The expression of a woman who had prepared for this moment and was executing the preparation. Not guilty, not apologetic, just composed, just ready. The congratulations continued around him. His mother hugged Melissa. His father shook Jake's hand. His cousin asked to see the ring. His aunt said something about spring weddings. The room moved and spoke and celebrated, and Evan stood in the middle of it and tried to locate himself. He looked at the ring on her finger. He looked at Jake's hand on her back. He looked at his father, who was smiling at Jake with the uncomplicated pride of a man whose younger son had just announced something good. His father had not looked at him yet. He looked at his mother. His mother was talking to his Aunt Patricia, warm, animated, the hostess in her element. She reached for Melissa's hand, said something about the ring, laughed at the response. She still had not looked at Evan. He looked at his cousin Greg. Greg was looking at the couple. But when Greg's eyes moved, the casual scan of a room, that people did without thinking, they found Evan for a half-second, and then moved away. Too quickly. The way eyes moved away from something they had been told not to look at directly. Evan looked at the room. He looked at every face in it. And what he saw, not in any single expression, but in the collective grammar of how the room was behaving, in what was missing, as much as what was present, was that nobody was surprised. Not one person in this room was processing new information tonight. The applause hadn't been the applause of people hearing something unexpected. It had been the applause of people who had been waiting to be allowed to applaud. The room had been holding this. All of them had been holding it and performing the holding, and had just been released from the performance. Evan looked at his mother. He waited. She was going to have to look at him. Eventually she did. Their eyes met across the living room. His mother's eyes, the eyes he had looked at his entire life, for the specific warmth that had always been there, that had always meant, you are my son and I love you, and this house is yours, as much as it is anyone's. For one moment she held his gaze, then she looked away. Not to Jake, not to Melissa, just away, sideways, into the middle distance, the specific direction of someone who cannot hold the gaze of a person they have wronged. Evan set his champagne glass on the mantelpiece. He stood very still, in his parents' living room, on Christmas Eve, and understood, in the way you understood things, that your body processed, before your mind caught up, that the worst was not behind him. The worst, it turned out, had been in this room, the whole time. He drove for 40 minutes before he stopped, not toward anywhere, just away. The expressway opening up in front of him. In the cold Christmas Eve dark, the lights of other cars, moving in both directions, with the indifferent continuity of a world that had not just shifted on its axis. He pulled into a gas station parking lot off I-88 and sat with the engine running and the heat on and both hands on the wheel and tried to identify what he was feeling. The feeling didn't have a clean name. Shock was part of it, but shock implied surprise. And something about the evening had felt, in retrospect, less like a surprise and more like a reveal, like the answer to a question he hadn't known he'd been asking. He sat there. He thought about his mother's eyes, moving away from his. He took out his phone. He called his cousin Greg first, not because Greg was the person he most wanted to talk to, but because Greg was the person most likely to tell him the truth, without the protective framing that closer family would apply. Greg was a decent man, with a weak spot for honesty, when honesty was being directly requested. Evan had known this his entire life, and had been counting on it. For approximately the last 40 minutes, Greg answered on the third ring. "Hey," Greg said, the single syllable carrying considerably more freight than a single syllable usually carried. "How long have you known?" Evan said. A pause. "Evans, I'm not asking you to apologize right now. I'm asking how long." The pause was longer this time. The pause of a man doing the math of honesty. What he could say, what he couldn't take back once he'd said it, what the person on the other end of the phone both needed and didn't need to hear. "Since October," Greg said finally. "October. 2 months ago." "Did everyone know in October?" Evan said. "Not everyone. Your parents have known longer." "How much longer?" "I don't know exactly. A while." "A while," Evan said. "I'm sorry, man, I didn't. There wasn't a good way to." "It's okay," Evan said. It wasn't okay, but the conversation was already giving him what he needed, and what he didn't need right now was to manage Greg's guilt on top of everything else. "Thanks," he said. He hung up. He called his Aunt Patricia next. Patricia was his mother's sister, 64 direct, the family member who had always said the thing other people were thinking, and then been mildly surprised when it caused friction. She answered on the second ring. He asked the same question. "Since the summer," she said. "Summer. 6 months ago, at minimum." "Did my mother tell you?" he said. A pause. "Your mother didn't have to tell me," Patricia said. "I could see it at the 4th of July." He thought about the 4th of July. The barbecue at his parents' house. Jake had been there. Melissa had been there. She still came to family events for the kids' sake, or that was the stated reason. He thought about that afternoon. He tried to remember if there had been something to see. He couldn't remember paying attention. "Why didn't you say anything?" he said. Another pause. "Longer." "Your mother asked me not to," Patricia said. "She wanted to handle it in her own time. She kept saying she was waiting for the right moment." The right moment. Evan looked through his windshield. At the gas station, a man was filling his tank, in the cold, breath-fogging, moving with the practical efficiency of someone who wanted to be somewhere warm. "Thanks, Patricia," he said. He hung up. He sat for a moment. Then he called his friend Marcus. Not family, but someone who had known both him and Melissa for the better part of 15 years, who had been at his wedding, who had helped him move out of the house when the marriage ended. Marcus answered. Evan didn't ask a question this time. He just said, "Did you know about Jake?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a very long silence. From Marcus, who was not a silent man. "When did you find out?" Marcus said. "Tonight," Evan said. "Jesus." "When did you find out?" Evan said. "A few months ago, I ran into them. At a restaurant." A pause. "I didn't know what to do with it, man. I kept thinking it wasn't my place. But then I kept thinking, that made me the same as everyone else. And I hated that, I really did." "It's okay," Evan said again. He was getting good at saying things he didn't mean, with the right amount of calm. He thanked Marcus. He ended the call. He sat in the parking lot and counted. Greg knew for 2 months. Patricia knew since July. His parents had known longer. How much longer he didn't know yet. Marcus had known for months. The number of people who had been carrying this information, who had sat across from him at tables, hugged him at gatherings, asked about his kids, talked about his business, while knowing, was not a small number. He started the car. He drove to his apartment. He sat at his kitchen table and didn't sleep until 4 in the morning. Emma called on Christmas Day. She was 20, a sophomore at Northwestern, home for the holidays, and she called with the specific energy of someone who had been waiting to call all morning. "Dad," she said. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay," he said. "Last night was," she stopped. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "You didn't know." I assumed someone had told you." He processed this. "You knew," he said. "I found out in September. They came to my apartment. They, Jake and Melissa." together, at his daughter's apartment. In September, they wanted to talk to me. Before telling the family, Emma said, they said they wanted to be honest with me. They asked me not to say anything until they were ready. Evan looked at the wall of his kitchen. Did Tyler know? He said. I don't think so. Tyler wouldn't. You know Tyler. He did know Tyler. Tyler was 17 and had his father's particular inability to hold anything back. If Tyler had known, Evan would have known. Emma, he said carefully. How long have they been together? Do you know? A pause. He could hear her calibrating the specific careful silence of a young woman who loved both her parents and had been placed between them in a position she hadn't chosen. I don't know exactly, she said, but you have a sense. Another pause. Dad, I'm not going to fall apart. I just need to understand what I'm dealing with. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said slowly, when I was in high school, maybe junior year, I remember Chunklj coming over a lot. Like a lot. Even when you weren't home. Junior year, Tyler was a junior now. Emma was 3 years older. That would put it at. He did the arithmetic. He sat with the number. I always thought it was weird. Emma said, but I was a teenager. I didn't really. She stopped. I'm sorry, Dad. Don't apologize, he said. You didn't do anything. He kept his voice steady. He was very far from steady. I love you, he said. Merry Christmas. He ended the call. He sat at his kitchen table. For a long time, Emma was a junior in high school, 3 years before the divorce. That was 6 years ago. He thought about 6 years ago. He thought about what 6 years ago had looked like. 6 years ago, the marriage had been difficult, not in the dramatic way of marriages people described afterward, as I knew it was over, in the quiet, erosive way of two people who had grown differently and had stopped talking about it, because talking about it required energy they didn't have. He'd been building the business. Long hours, weekends, the particular self-justifying math of an entrepreneur who told himself the sacrifice was temporary, that the hours would decrease once the revenue stabilized, that his family understood, because he'd explained it, and they'd nodded. Melissa had been different, he'd noticed different. A quality of distraction, small withdrawals, the way she was sometimes present in a room in a way that made him feel more alone than if she'd been absent. He'd attributed it to the marriage being difficult. He had been, he understood now, correct about the diagnosis, and entirely wrong about the cause. He went to his laptop. He opened Facebook. He found his cousin Amy's profile. Amy, who took photographs of everything, who had built a documentary quality record of every family event. For the past decade, he started scrolling through her albums. It took him 40 minutes. He found it in an album labeled Parker Family Summer, 6 years ago. A photo from a backyard barbecue. The kind of photo that appeared in 100 albums from that summer. Casual, mid-conversation. Someone laughing at something. Someone else had just said. Jake and Melissa were standing at the edge of the frame. Not touching. Not doing anything. That would have registered as wrong in any photograph. But standing at the angle that people stood at when they were trying not to stand too close to someone they wanted to be close to. He recognized the angle. He'd seen it in photographs of himself and Melissa early in their relationship, before there was a relationship, the specific geometry of two people managing the gravitational pull between them. Jake's eyes were on her. Melissa was looking at the camera, but her body was turned 3 degrees toward Jake, just 3 degrees. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking for it, in the way a plant turned toward the light, without meaning to. He looked at the date on the album, 6 years and 2 months ago. He looked at the photo. For a long time, he thought about 17 years of marriage. He thought about the years inside those 17, when he'd been building something, a business, a life, the architecture of a future, while something else was being built behind him. He thought about every Christmas dinner at his parents' house during those years, every birthday, every holiday, Jake across the table, warm and charming, hugging him when he arrived, clapping him on the back when he left. He thought about what a person was doing when they sat across from you at Christmas dinner and looked you in the eyes and called you brother. He closed the laptop. He sat in his kitchen on Christmas Day with the city quiet outside and the particular silence of a man who had just watched the architecture of 16 years rearrange itself into something he didn't recognize. He thought about his mother. He thought about the 4th of July. He thought about his Aunt Patricia saying, "Your mother asked me not to. She was waiting for the right moment." He thought about how many right moments there had been, how many birthdays and dinners, and phone calls and holidays, how many times someone in his family had looked at him and decided that today was not the right moment. He thought about what it meant, that there was no version of any of those moments in which they had chosen him. Not once, not in however many months or years they had been choosing what to protect. They had never chosen to protect him. He thought about that for a long time, and then he stopped thinking and simply sat with what was true. The people in that room last night had known, all of them, for a long time, and every single one of them had decided, separately and collectively, that the most important thing to protect was not him. Tyler found out on December 27th, not from Evan, not from Emma, not from anyone in the family who might have delivered the information with some degree of care or context or preparation. He found out the way 17-year-olds found out everything in the current century, from his phone, from a friend who had seen the engagement announcement on Instagram, from a screenshot sent with the message, "Dude, is this your uncle and your mom?" Evan was at the hardware store when Tyler called. He almost didn't answer. He'd been in the careful, methodical mode he'd adopted since Christmas Eve, the mode of a man who understood that the only thing standing between him and something that looked like falling apart was the maintenance of routine. But he saw his son's name and picked up. "Dad." Tyler's voice was wrong. Not wrong like something had happened. Wrong like several things had happened and were still happening. And his voice was trying to carry all of them at once. "Hey, what's going on?" Is it true? Not a question. The flat delivery of someone who already knew the answer and was giving one last courtesy opportunity for the answer to be different. Evan stood in the hardware store between the paint supplies and the power tools and looked at a display of measuring tape he wasn't seeing. "Yeah," he said, "it's true." Silence. "Then's how long?" "I'm still figuring that out." "Dad," his voice shifted, the specific register of a teenage boy who had been trying to sound adult and had just run out of the ability to keep trying. "How long's have they been? How long has this been?" "I don't know exactly, but not recent." Evan thought about a photo in a Facebook album, about 3 degrees of lean, about junior year of high school. "No," he said, "probably not recent." What came out of Tyler next was not words exactly. It was the sound of someone who had been built to expect a certain architecture of loyalty and had just been shown the foundation was different than advertised. 17 years old, his son, finding out his uncle had been in love with his mother while his parents were still married. "I'm coming over," Evan said. Tyler was sitting on the front steps of Evan's apartment building. When he arrived, he'd driven from his mother's house, from Melissa's house, which was still technically the arrangement on paper, Tyler's primary residence, during the school year, and he was sitting in a jacket that wasn't warm enough for December, with his phone in his hand, and the specific expression of someone who had been angry for 45 minutes and had arrived at the phase on the other side of anger that didn't have a good name. Evan sat down beside him. They sat on the cold steps together. "She knew I would find out." Tyler said she had to know. "She put it on Instagram. She probably figured you'd hear it from family. She didn't tell me herself." Evan thought about this. Melissa had told Emma personally, had gone to her apartment, had asked for time. She had not told Tyler. "I know," he said. "Why didn't she tell me?" He thought about several answers. He chose the honest one, which was also the incomplete one. "I think she knew how you'd react." Tyler made a sound. That wasn't quite a laugh. "Because I would have told you." He said, "That's why she didn't tell me. Because I would have called you the same day." He was right. Evan didn't say so, because saying so would have been the beginning of a conversation about why Emma had not called him the same day. And that was a conversation for a different time. "When's the wedding?" Tyler said. "I don't know yet." "Am I supposed to go?" "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do." "Grandma called me this morning." Tyler said, she said. He stopped. His jaw tightened. In the way Evan's jaw tightened, he'd always had his father's jaw. The same involuntary tell. "Under pressure," she said. "She hoped I would think about what this means for the family." that she wanted everyone together, that it would mean a lot to Jake and to Mom. If we could all. He stopped again. She called you on December 27th, Evan said carefully, to ask you to support your uncle's engagement. To Mom, Tyler said, yeah. They sat on the cold steps. A car went past. Someone walking a dog. The ordinary machinery of a neighborhood on a Tuesday. In late December. I'm not going, Tyler said. He said it the way Evan had said things. At 17. Without nuance. Without the diplomatic padding that adults learn to wrap things in. With the pure, undiluted clarity of someone for whom the right answer was simply the right answer, and the reasons were obvious, and the people asking him to feel differently about the obvious were the ones who had something wrong with them. Evan looked at his son. He felt in that moment the specific complicated love of a father watching his child be exactly right about something the father wished he didn't have to be right about. Okay, he said. You're not going to tell me I should reconsider. No. Tyler looked at him. Grandma's going to keep calling, he said. Probably. And you're not going to make me go. Tyler. Evan put a hand on his son's shoulder. You're 17. You get to decide what you're willing to walk into. I'm not putting that on you. His son looked at him. For a moment, the look of someone checking whether the thing they'd been told was actually true. And then he nodded. And they sat on the steps in the December cold and didn't talk for a while, which was its own form of the conversation they needed to have. The family campaign took approximately 1 week to fully mobilize. His mother called Evan on New Year's Eve. She led with warmth. How was he? How were the kids? She'd been thinking about him, and Evan let her lead with warmth and waited. The point arrived around the 6-minute mark. I just want to say, she said in the tone she used when she'd rehearsed something, that I know this is hard, and I know your feelings are complicated, but Jake and Melissa are building a life together, and as a family, we need to find a way to support that. Evan said, do we? A pause. They love each other, Evan. He thought about a photo in a Facebook album about junior year, about 17 years. I'm sure they do, he said. And the children. If Tyler and Emma can see that their uncle and their mother are happy. Mom, he said. She stopped. Did you know? Before the divorce, he said. The pause was very long. I had some concerns, she said finally. Some things I wondered about. Did you say anything to me? I didn't want to. I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to create problems. If I was wrong. Mom. She went quiet. I'm going to need some time, he said, before I can have this conversation about supporting the family. He ended the call. He made himself a drink. He didn't finish and watched the city count down to New Year. From his window, the custody papers arrived in February. His attorney, Sandra Chen, who had handled the divorce and who had the specific, implacable competence of a family law specialist who had seen the entire range of what people were capable of and had stopped being surprised by most of it, called him on a Thursday morning. She's filed for modification, Sandra said, claiming material change of circumstances. What circumstances? Evan said. The filing cites instability, specifically your emotional state. Following the Christmas announcement, there's a claim that you've been erratic in communication with the children, that Tyler witnessed a confrontation. Evan thought about Tyler. On the front steps, the most confrontational thing that had happened was sitting in the cold together. That's not accurate, he said. I didn't think it was, Sandra said. But I want you prepared. This kind of filing is often less about custody and more about leverage. The question is what she's looking for leverage for. He thought about Jake. He thought about Jake's business, a commercial real estate operation that had been built in part on relationships and contracts that Evan's contracting business had helped create. The overlapping professional histories of two brothers who had been, until recently, family. She has a new partner now, Evan said. Yes, Sandra said, which is relevant. I'd like to do some discovery on the financial side. If there's a new household forming, we should understand what that means for the support structure. Do what you need to do, Evan said. Sandra did what she needed to do. 3 weeks later, she called him again. I want to show you something, she said. He went to her office. She had a tablet on her desk with a series of text messages. On the screen, the chain was between two numbers. Jake's number, which Evan recognized, and Melissa's. Sandra had put a post-it note on the corner of the tablet with a single date written on it. Evan looked at the date. He looked at Sandra. "Where did these come from?" he said. "Her phone records. We subpoenaed them as part of the financial discovery. She's claiming increased expenses to justify the modification, so we're entitled to look at communications related to the financial decisions." Evan looked at the messages. He read several of them. The messages were not about finances. They were about logistics, specific, detailed, coordinated logistics around a legal strategy, language choices, timeline management, the specific language of two people working through a problem together and tracking toward a shared outcome. He looked at the date on the post-it note. "This is 1 week before she filed for divorce," he said. Sandra's expression didn't change. She'd been doing this long enough to have learned the expression she wore when she was giving a client a moment to process something that was going to change the shape of the case. "Yes," she said. Evan sat in Sandra Chen's office in February with a tablet in his hands and a date on a post-it note, and the specific sensation of a man who had thought he understood the story he was living in and had just been informed that he had been, from the beginning, a character in a story with a different plot than the one he believed. "What does this mean?" he said. "Legally." "It means," Sandra said, setting the tablet down on her desk with the careful deliberateness of someone placing a very specific object in a very specific position, "that your brother was involved in the legal strategy of your divorce before your divorce began." She looked at him. "Mr. Parker," she said. He looked at her. "These texts were sent the week before your wife's filed for divorce." The office was very quiet. Outside the window, Chicago in February was doing what Chicago did in February, gray and cold and ongoing. The city indifferent to what was happening in any particular office, on any particular floor. Evan looked at the date on the post-it note. He thought about his brother at Christmas dinner, at every Christmas dinner. The warmth of him, the eyes, the hand on Melissa's back. He thought about the hug when he'd arrived, brief, solid, the physical shorthand of brothers. He thought about Sandra's words, "Before your divorce began." He put the tablet down. He sat back in the chair. He didn't say anything for a long time, and Sandra, who had been doing this long enough to know when a client needed a long time, did not say anything either. The timeline took Sandra's paralegal 3 weeks to assemble. Evan received it on a Thursday afternoon. A 12-page document, organized chronologically, cross-referenced against phone records, financial records, the subpoenaed texts, and 3 additional sources Sandra didn't detail, but described as corroborating evidence from the discovery process. He read it at his kitchen table. He read it twice, then he put it face down on the tables and sat with his hands flat on the back of it for a long time, as though the pressure of his hands could hold the contents in place, prevent them from being fully, permanently real. He turned it back over. He read it a third time. The timeline began not with the texts Sandra had shown him. Those were, it turned out, not the beginning, but simply the first thing the discovery process had found. The beginning, as best as the evidence could establish it, was approximately 4 years before the divorce. There was a pattern in the phone records, a specific number appearing with increasing frequency in Melissa's call history, a number Evan recognized as Jake's personal cell, not the number Jake used for business or family communication, but the number he used for the people he kept separately. The frequency increased gradually, the slow escalation of contact that wasn't supposed to exist, and then plateaued into something consistent, something regular, the communication pattern of people who had established a rhythm together. The financial records told a parallel story. Restaurant charges on Melissa's credit card, places in neighborhoods neither of them lived or worked in, the specific geography of people who ate together in places where they weren't likely to be recognized, hotel charges, 3 of them in an 18-month window, 2 years before the divorce, charges Evan had seen on the statements at the time and had been told were work events, a conference, a night she'd stayed with a colleague, rather than driving home late. He'd believed her. He'd had no reason not to believe her. He looked at the hotel charges in the timeline and thought about the specific arithmetic of 17 years of trust, the accumulated credit of a marriage that had worked mostly for most of its duration, and how that accumulated credit had functioned in the end as exactly the thing that made the deception possible. He'd trusted her because they had 17 years of reasons to trust each other. He'd trusted his brother because they had 44 years of being brothers. He understood now, betrayed precisely because the betrayal had been built on the foundation of everything real that had existed before it. The realest things had been used as the delivery mechanism for the most unreal thing. He drove to his parents' house on a Saturday morning. He hadn't called ahead. His mother answered the door with the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit, in the way you expected things you had been dreading, with the specific combination of relief that it was finally happening and dread that it was finally happening. She let him in. His father was at the kitchen table. Frank Parker looked at his son with the careful expression of a man who understood that the morning was going to require something from him that he wasn't sure he had available. "I'll give you a minute," Frank said. He went to the living room. Evan sat across from his mother. He put the timeline on the table, not to show her she wouldn't need to read it, just to have it present, the way you had evidence present, even when the other party already knew what it contained. "Tell me when you knew," he said. Linda Parker was 67 years old and had the quality common in women who had spent decades managing the emotion of a household, of being able to hold very difficult things in a face that revealed only what she chose to reveal. She looked at the timeline. She looked at her hands. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "Please," he said. She took a breath. "I had a feeling," she said. "Probably 5 years ago. Maybe 5.5. 5.5 years ago. 6 months before the earliest entry in Sandra's timeline." "What kind of feeling?" he said. "The way they were around each other," she said. "At Easter, I think it was. Something about the way." Melissa laughed at something Jake said it was. She stopped. A mother notices things she doesn't want to notice. "Did you say anything to Jake?" he said. A pause. "I asked him once. About 6 months later. I asked him if there was anything I should know about." "What did he say?" "He said no. He said I was imagining things." He was, she looked at her hands. He was convincing. "What about after the divorce?" he said. "When it became clear they were together. Did you ask him then?" "By then," she stopped. "By then I suppose I understood that I hadn't been imagining things. And Jake told us it had started after the divorce, that nothing had happened while you were still married." "Did you believe him?" he said. The silence this time was the longest one yet. Linda Parker looked at her son, and for the first time in Evan's memory, for the first time in 44 years of being her son and watching her face, she looked genuinely, uncomplicatedly old, not physically diminished, just tired, the specific tiredness of someone who had been carrying a version of the truth for years and had just been asked to set it down. "No," she said quietly. "I didn't believe him." The kitchen was very still. "But I didn't." She stopped, started again. "I didn't want to be the one who broke up your marriage. If I said something, and I was wrong." "You weren't wrong," he said. "I know. You knew you weren't wrong." She didn't answer. She looked at the window. He looked at his mother, the woman who had made Sunday dinners and Christmas roasts, and the same smell when you walked through the door, the woman who had sat on the edge of his bed when he had fevers as a child, and had been, for the first decade of his life, the fixed point around which everything else orbited. He looked at hers and thought about what it meant to know something and choose not to know it. Not malice, not cruelty, just the particular cowardice of a parent who had loved both her sons and had chosen, in the absence of certainty, to protect the peace over the person who would be most hurt by the disruption of it. "Mom," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not coming for a while," he said. "I need you to understand that. It's not permanent, but I can't sit at this table right now and pretend we're okay." Her eyes were wet. "I know," she said. "I love you," he said. "That's not the question. The question is what you did with what you knew. And I need time with that question." He stood. He picked up the timeline. He went to the living room doorway. His father was in the armchair, not watching the television that was on in front of him. "Dad," Evan said. Frank looked at him. His father's face had always been the harder one to read. Frank Parker processed things internally and released them slowly, if at all. The emotional metabolism of a man who had learned that expression was often more costly than containment. But he looked at his son now with something that wasn't the careful neutrality he usually maintained. He looked at him with the expression of a man who knew what he'd allowed to happen by allowing the wrong things to happen in his own house. He didn't say anything. He nodded once. It wasn't enough, but it was. Evan understood everything his father had. He left the house. The wedding invitation arrived on a Thursday in March. He found it in his mailbox, a thick cream envelope, the kind that meant someone had spent real money on the stationery, with his name written on the front in calligraphy that he recognized as Melissa's handwriting. She had addressed it herself. He stood in the hallway of his building and held it for a moment before opening it. The invitation was what invitations were: formal, tasteful, the coordinated aesthetics of a couple who had planned this presentation carefully. Jake Thomas Parker and Melissa Ann Parker, request the honor of your presence. He read his ex-wife's new name on the invitation, Melissa Ann Parker. She was keeping his name. He stood with that for a moment. Inside the envelope, behind the invitation itself, was a small card, not printed, handwritten, in Jake's handwriting. This time, "Evans, we know this is hard. We know it's a lot to ask, but we want to heal. As brothers, as a family, your being there would mean everything. We hope you'll come. Jake." Evan read the note twice. He thought about Sandra's office, about a tablet on a desk, about texts sent the week before the divorce was filed. He thought about a timeline, assembled over 3 weeks, by a paralegal, from phone records and hotel charges, and the specific geography of restaurants in neighborhoods where you weren't likely to be recognized. He thought about his mother's voice. "I didn't want to be the one who broke up your marriage." He thought about the invitation in his hand, the thick cream envelope, the calligraphy, the expense of the stationery, and he thought about what a wedding was beyond the ceremony itself. A wedding was a record. It was photographs, and a guest list, and a room full of people who functioned as witnesses, not just to vows, but to a version of a family that was being presented. For the record, a wedding with Evan in it told a different story than a wedding without him. With him in it, the photograph said, the family is intact. The brother was there. Everyone moved forward together. This was a love story that the whole family could stand inside of. Without him, the photograph said, something is missing. Something is wrong. The brother didn't come. The story has a gap in it that the people looking would notice, whether or not anyone pointed it out. Jake wanted him there for the same reason. You wanted a particular chair in a particular photograph, not because of the chair's feelings, but because of the composition. We want to heal. He put the invitation on his kitchen counter. He stood and looked at it. For a long time, he thought about what his brother expected him to do. He thought about what he was actually going to do. The decision, when it arrived, didn't feel like a decision. It felt like a recognition, the acknowledgement of something he'd probably known since he was standing in his parents' living room, watching his mother look away from his eyes. He was going to go, not because Jake asked, not because healing was real, not because of family, or composition, or what the photographs would say. He was going because 17 years of his life had been conducted in this family, in these rooms, at these tables, in the presence of these people, and he was owed one room, one moment, one opportunity to say something true in front of all of them. At once, he was going because Jake had made the specific mistake of underestimating him. He left the invitation on the counter. He went to his desk. He opened his laptop. He started writing. He arrived at the wedding alone. The venue was a converted loft in the West Loop, exposed brick, Edison lights, the aesthetic of a space that had been designed to look uncontrived and had cost significantly to achieve that look. He'd worn a dark suit, not his best suit. He didn't have anything to prove about the suit, just a dark suit, a white shirt, no tie. The presentation of a man who had shown up without performing the showing up. He arrived at the ceremony 10 minutes before it started and sat in the third row on the groom's side, which was also technically his side, and he sat quietly while the room filled and the music started and the family assembled itself around him. His mother sat 2 rows back. She saw him immediately. He felt her see him without looking at her. His father came in and chose a seat on the opposite end of the row, which Evan understood as neither a rejection nor an endorsement, but simply his father doing what his father did, which was put physical distance between himself and situations that required him to have a position. Cousins, aunts, family, friends, the assembled witnesses of a Parker family event, the same people, largely, who had been in his parents' living room on Christmas Eve, who had applauded while he stood in the warmth of a house that had just become a different place. They looked at him. He looked back. Several of them smiled, the relieved smile of people who had been worried about this exact scenario and were now reassured that the scenario was going to be manageable. He smiled back. He was very good by now at smiling back. The ceremony was 22 minutes long. He watched his brother stand at the end of the aisle and watch Melissa walk toward him, the same walk Evan had watched 17 years ago in a church in Evanston. The same quality of attention Jake was giving her now that Evan had given her then. He watched his brother marry his ex-wife. He felt the specific thing he'd expected to feel, not the gutting grief of someone watching love destroyed, but something colder and more structural, the recognition of a theft being legitimized in front of witnesses. The vows were traditional. He heard the words and thought about the texts sent the week before the divorce was filed. He heard honors and thought about hotel receipts in neighborhoods where you wouldn't be recognized. He heard forsaking all others and thought about a photo in a Facebook album, 3 degrees of lean, a date stamped in the corner that he had memorized. He sat through all of it. He sat through all of it quietly, with his hands in his lap and his face arranged into something neutral. And when the room applauded, at the end, he did not applaud, but nobody was looking at him, and nobody noticed. The reception was in the room adjacent, same loft, extended space, round tables and centerpieces, and the warm organized chaos of 200 people moving from ceremony to celebration. He found his seat. He'd been placed at table 7, which was the table for family members. The seating chart didn't know what to do with his cousin Greg, his aunt Patricia, 2 of Melissa's cousins. He'd met 4 times over the course of the marriage and had nothing to say to now. He sat. He ate the first course. He talked to Greg, who was trying too hard, the specific effortfulness of someone performing normalcy in a situation that didn't support it, and Evan was kind to him about it because Greg's crime had been cowardice, not malice, and Evan was finding he had more room for cowardice than for the other thing. The band played. People danced. Jake and Melissa moved through the room with the practiced ease of a couples who had planned this evening in detail, greeting tables, laughing at the right moments, touching each other with the unself-conscious ease of people who had been doing this in private for years and were simply now doing it in public. He watched his brother work the room. Jake Parker's had always been the one who worked rooms, the social gift, the easy warmth, the quality of making people feel that his attention was the thing they'd been waiting for. Evan watched him and thought, "You have been practicing this your entire life." The charm wasn't new. The performance wasn't new. Only the audience was new. At 9:15, between the main course and the dessert, the best man, one of Jake's friends from his college years, stood up and gave a toast that was warm and funny and touched on several of Jake's qualities in the way of wedding toasts that required you to account for the groom's character without accounting for it too precisely. When he sat down, Jake stood up. He thanked the best man. He thanked the family. He said something about Melissa that made the room respond warmly. Then he looked toward table 7. "I'd also like to acknowledge," Jake said, in the specific tone of a man performing magnanimity, "someone who, I know this hasn't been easy, took the time to be here tonight. That took courage, and it means more to me than I can say." He raised his glass toward Evan. The room followed. 200 people, looking at Evan Parker, raising their glasses, to his willingness to be in this room. Evan raised his glass. He smiled. Jake smiled back. The full smile, the room-filling smile, the smile of a man who believed he had just demonstrated publicly that his brother had surrendered. Actually, Jake said, still holding the warmth of the moment. Evan, I know public speaking isn't your thing, but is there anything you'd like to say? He held out the microphone, an offering, a magnanimous gesture from the man who had won. Evan looked at the microphone. He looked at his brother. He thought about a timeline in a 12-page document. He thought about texts sent the week before a divorce was filed. He thought about his mother's eyes moving away from his on Christmas Eve. He thought about Tyler on the front steps in the cold. He thought about Emma at her apartment in September, being asked to keep a secret by the two people who should have been asking her nothing except what she needed. He stood up. He took the microphone. The room was expecting a short toast, 30 seconds, 45 at most, the polite contribution of a man making peace with a difficult situation. He could see it on their faces, the prepared reception of something brief and gracious, the slight collective lean forward of people ready to applaud. As soon as he finished, he held the microphone. He looked at the room. He spoke. Jake asked me if there's anything I'd like to say, and I've been thinking about that for a while actually, what I'd like to say, so I'll say it. He paused, not for effect, just to make sure his voice was where he needed it. Level, even. The voice of a man who was not performing anything. I've been married in this family. I know how the Parkers show up for each other. I've been at tables in this family for 44 years. And what I've learned, what this year has taught me, more specifically, is that a family can be two things at once. It can be real, and it can be a performance. It can love you and use you simultaneously. And the people inside it can be both things at once too. Genuinely good, in ways that are also genuinely untrue. The room was no longer leaning forward with expectation. It was very still. I don't have a problem with Jake and Melissa being together, he said. People fall in love. Marriages end. None of that is simple. And I'm not standing here pretending it is. He looked at Jake. Jake's smile had not entirely left. It was still there, in the way things are still there when the person wearing them hasn't yet decided to take them off. What I'd like to say is about the timeline, Evan said. Someone in the room made a sound, the involuntary noise of a person recognizing a word they had hoped wouldn't be spoken. I have phone records, he said. I have financial records. I have texts, specifically texts, between the two people being celebrated tonight, from the week before my divorce was filed, not after the divorce. Before it was filed, the smile was gone now. Melissa had gone very still, in the way of someone whose control of a situation has just changed hands. I'm not reading them out loud, Evan said. I'm not interested in that kind of night, but I want the people in this room, the people who sat across from me at Christmas dinners and birthday parties and Thanksgiving tables for the better part of 4 years, to understand something. He looked at the room, at his cousin Greg, at his Aunt Patricia, at his mother, 2 rows back, who was looking at him with an expression he would think about for years. You knew, he said. Not all of you, but enough of you. You sat across from me, and you knew, and you made a decision. Not out of cruelty. I want to be fair about that, but out of the particular kind of love that protects itself over the people it claims to love. You chose the piece of the table over the person sitting at it. He paused. I'm not here tonight to hurt anyone. I'm here because I was asked to be here, and because I had something to say that I wanted to say in front of all of you at once, so that nobody in this room, nobody, can say they didn't know, that they weren't there, that they didn't hear it. He set the microphone on the table in front of him. He sat down. He picked up his water glass. He drank. The room was silent for approximately 4 seconds. Then it was not silent, not in the explosive way of a room that has erupted, but in the complicated way of a room in which 200 people are processing something, and the processing was audible. The band did not play. The servers had stopped moving. Jake was standing at the head table with the expression of a man whose calculation Give Evan the microphone. Demonstrate generosity. Let him say 30 seconds of gracious, difficult words. Absorb it, move on. Had encountered a reality it hadn't modeled. He said Evan's name. His voice was controlled. Jake Parker's social intelligence did not desert him completely, but underneath the control, something else was present, something that had not been in his voice before tonight. Evan looked at his brother. He had nothing more to say. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his phone from the table and put it in his pocket. He walked toward the exit. Behind him, he heard the room begin to reconstitute itself. The murmur, the movement, the collective assessment of what had just happened. And he did not look back. He pushed through the door. He stood on the sidewalk, outside the venue. In the March night, the West Loop quiet around him. The city doing what the city always did. Ongoing, indifferent, continuous. He felt, standing there, something he hadn't expected. Not triumph, not the hot release of someone who had finally said the thing he'd expected, that had been prepared for it. And it didn't come. What came instead was quieter and older and harder to name. The feeling of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down. Not finished, just set down. He called a car. He went home. The collapse, when it came, didn't come all at once. It came the way real collapses came. In pieces. Over time. The structural failures revealing themselves sequentially as the load shifted. The first piece. Marcus called him Monday morning. Word got out, Marcus said. I don't know who talked first, but the timeline thing. It's moving. Moving where? Evan said. Specifically toward Derek Calloway. Derek Calloway was Jake's primary business partner, a commercial real estate developer who had been working with Jake for 6 years, whose relationship with Jake had been built partly on Jake's relationship with Evan, on the professional intersection of the two brothers' businesses, on the implicit credibility that Jake had borrowed from Evan's reputation in the industry. Derek was at the wedding. Marcus said. I know, Evan said. He heard the speech. I know. A pause. He called Jake. First thing this morning. Marcus said. I heard this from someone who heard it from someone, so take it accordingly. But the word is, Derek is reconsidering. The Riverside Project. The Riverside Project was an $18 million commercial development that Jake had been structuring for the better part of 2 years. Okay, Evan said. You don't seem surprised, Marcus said. I'm not, Evan said. He wasn't. He'd known, standing at that microphone, that the people in the room were not just family. They were the network, the professional context, the community in which Jake Parker operated and had built a reputation. He hadn't said anything untrue. He hadn't needed to. Truth in the right room did its own work. The second piece came from Emma. She called him on Wednesday. Mom called me, she said. She's upset. I imagine she is, he said. She said. Emma paused. She said you embarrassed her. He let that land. How are you doing, he said. That's what I want to know. She stopped. Honestly, I think I'm okay. I think, another pause. I think it needed to happen. I don't think I could have said those things, Dad. I don't think anyone else was going to say them. You don't have to defend it, he said. I'm not defending it. I'm just telling you what I think. He thought about his daughter, 20 years old, being asked to manage a secret she hadn't chosen, being placed in the space between two versions of her family, and expected to navigate it without a map. I love you, he said. I love you too, she said. Tyler called me this morning. What did he say? A small sound that was almost a laugh. He said it was the best speech he'd ever heard in his life. Evan looked at the wall of his kitchen. He felt, for the first time in 3 months, something that was close to uncomplicated. Tell him I said thanks, he said. The third piece took longer. Jake called in April. Evan let it go to voicemail. He listened to the voicemail once. Jake's voice, controlled but tight, asking to talk, saying there were things he wanted to say, that there was more to the story. Evan deleted it. Not from anger, just from the recognition that there was nothing in that conversation that he needed. The things he'd needed from Jake Parker, the loyalty, the honesty, the brotherhood he'd believed in for 41 years, were not things Jake had available to give. Calling him back would not create them. He didn't call back. Melissa's attorney filed to drop the custody modification. In May, Sandra called to tell him. Apparently, the discovery process raised some concerns. On their end, she said, with the specific neutrality of an attorney describing an outcome she was satisfied with, in language that didn't reveal the satisfaction. What kind of concerns? Evan said. The kind that made continuing the modification seem inadvisable, Sandra said. He thanked her. He made a note in his calendar for Tyler's next baseball game. The kid was being looked at by 2 college scouts now, had found something in the field that was entirely his, that no family complication could reach. He made a note for Emma's homecoming weekend. She'd asked him to come up to meet her friends, to see where she lived. He made a note for the project in the western suburbs, the commercial development he described at Christmas dinner as the most interesting work he'd had in 2 years, which had since grown into something larger, something that was going to require his best attention for the better part of the next year. He closed the calendar. He looked at his apartment, small his the specific dimensions of a life that had been reassembled from the ruins of a larger one, and had turned out, in the reassembling, to be exactly the right size. He thought about his brother. He thought about his mother, who had called twice since the wedding, leaving careful messages, and whom he had not yet called back, but would, eventually, when the time was his to choose. He thought about a Christmas dinner 4 months ago, the smell when you walked in, through the door, the warmth, the accumulated safety of a house he'd believed his entire life. He thought about what it meant to believe in something that turned out to be partly true, not entirely false, just incomplete, and what you did with the parts that were real once you'd separated them from the parts that weren't. He wasn't sure yet. He was working on it. He thought that was enough. For now. 3 years passed. Not quietly, 3 years. Never passed quietly. When children were involved. When businesses needed attention. When the ordinary machinery of a life demanded the maintenance that ordinary lives demanded. But they passed, and on the other side of them, things were different, in ways that were both larger and smaller than Evan had expected. Tyler got a partial scholarship to the University of Iowa. Baseball, the scouts who had been watching him and his junior had become coaches, who called in his senior year, and Tyler Parker, who had his father's jaw and his father's inability to pretend things were okay when they weren't, had earned his way into a program that had nothing to do with his last name or his family's complications or anything except the specific, irreducible fact of what he could do on a baseball field. Evan drove him to Iowa City. In August, they loaded the dorm room together. The boxes, the bedding, the mini fridge Tyler had insisted on. And when they were done, they stood in the parking lot, in the heat, and Tyler looked at him with the expression of a 17-year-old boy who had become, somewhere in the past 3 years, something more than that. You're going to be fine, Evan said. I know, Tyler said. Not arrogance, just the simple confidence of someone who had been tested and had found out something true about himself. They hugged, the hug of a father and a son who had sat on cold front steps together and not needed to say much, and had found that enough. He drove home alone. He was okay. Emma graduated in May of the following year. Northwestern, urban planning, the field that had started as a practical choice and had become, over 4 years, a genuine vocation. She walked across the stage in the specific June light of a Midwestern graduation morning, and Evan sat in the stands with her roommate's parents and a cousin she'd invited, and applauded until his hands hurt. Afterward, at lunch, she said, "Mom came." He hadn't known. He'd arranged his arrival time specifically to avoid, but it didn't matter. It was Emma's day. Good, he said. She looked. Emma paused. She and Jake looked tired. He thought about what he knew. The things Marcus reported. The things Sandra had mentioned. In passing. The pieces that reached him. Without his seeking them. The Riverside Project had not recovered. Derek Calloway had restructured the partnership in terms that were significantly less favorable to Jake. 2 other professional relationships had followed a similar pattern. Not explosively, just the quiet recession of trust from a man whose reliability had been publicly questioned. In a room full of witnesses, Melissa had gone back to work, full-time at a firm, the resumption of a career. She'd paused during the marriage, And the resumption had apparently been less straightforward than anticipated. He didn't know the details. He didn't need the details. He knew the shape of it. Two people who had built something on a foundation that required constant maintenance to look like a foundation. The maintenance of mutual complicity, the shared management of a story, and who were discovering that maintenance was exhausting in a way that ordinary love was not. I'm not glad she's struggling, he said to Emma. I know, Emma said. He stopped. I hope she finds what she was actually looking for. I genuinely hope that. Emma looked at him. Do you? She said. Not challenging, just checking. He thought about it honestly. Yeah, he said, I do. He meant it. The anger had not disappeared. He didn't think anger, like his, disappeared. Exactly. But it had changed shape. Become less hot. More structural. The kind of thing you acknowledged was there, without needing it to do anything for you. He was no longer waiting for anything from Melissa. He was no longer waiting for anything from Jake. That was the difference between now and 3 years ago. Not the anger being gone, but the waiting being over. His mother called every Sunday. Not every Sunday had been easy. There had been a period in the year after the wedding when the calls were careful, in a way that made them harder than silence would have been. The weight of what hadn't been said, pressing through the surface of ordinary conversation. But they had continued. He had continued. Not because everything was resolved. He understood now that some things didn't resolve exactly so much as they found the level they could be lived at. But because she was his mother, and because the things she had done wrong didn't erase the things that were real, and because he had decided at some point in the past 3 years that he was done requiring completeness from things that weren't complete. His father had called once, a Sunday in October, out of sequence, Frank Parker calling when it wasn't his turn, which was unprecedented. In Evan's memory, he'd said, I want to say something. Evan had waited. I should have said something. When I knew, I should have found a way. A pause, I didn't. And I've thought about it a lot. That's all I wanted to say. Frank Parker, 69 years old, in the armchair, in the living room, having found, late, insufficient, but found, the words, thanks Dad, Evan had said. It wasn't enough. It was also something. He'd accepted it as something. He saw Jake once, in the 3rd year, not by arrangement. They were both at a restaurant, in the West Loop, different parties, different tables, the accidental geography of two people who still occupied the same city. Jake saw him first. He watched his brother make the calculation, the same calculation Jake had always made quickly in social situations, and watched him walk over. Hey, Jake said. Hey, Evan said. They stood for a moment, 44 years of being brothers, compressed into the space between them, in a restaurant in Chicago, on a Wednesday evening. Jake looked like himself. The charm was still there. The A's, though both were operating at a slightly lower wattage than they had been in the years before everything. I don't know what to say. Jake said. You don't have to say anything. Evan said. I want to. Jake, he said it quietly. There's nothing you can say to me. That changes the timeline. You know that. Jake looked at him. I know, he said. A silence. Are the kids okay? Jake said. He thought about Tyler, in Iowa City, throwing a baseball, in the specific late summer light of a college baseball field. He thought about Emma, in her office, in Lincoln Park, doing work she'd chosen. Yeah, he said, they're great. Something moved in his brother's face. Not guilt exactly. The thing that came after guilt had run its course. Good, Jake said. That's good. He went back to his table. Evan watched him go. He thought about 44 years. He thought about a kid, 3 years younger than him, who had spent those years wanting what he had, not from malice, probably, but from the specific hunger of someone who had always been the second version of a thing the family had already had, a first version of. He thought about how that hunger over time had stopped being about him, had become something Jake carried independently, directed inward, the weight of a person who had organized their life around wanting what someone else had, and had gotten it, and was discovering that getting it hadn't done what he'd needed it to do. He turned back to his table. He had dinner with a friend. He didn't think about Jake. Again that evening. The conversation with Emma happened on a Saturday in October, 3 years and 10 months. After Christmas Eve, in his parents' living room, she came to his apartment for dinner. She did this once a month now. A regular thing. The ritual establishment of a relationship between a father and an adult daughter. That was different from the relationship they'd had when she was a child, and better in ways that the childhood version couldn't have been. They ate. They talked about her work, a development project in the South Side she was genuinely excited about. They talked about Tyler, who was having a good sophomore season, who had called hers the week before to talk about a girl he liked. After dinner, she helped him clear the dishes, the way she'd done since she was old enough to carry plates. The domestic rhythm of two people who knew the shape of each other's kitchen. And when they were done, she leaned against the counter and looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always," he said. "Are you happy?" He looked at his daughter, 23 years old. The question asked directly, without the padding she would have put around it. At 14 or 18, the specific directness of someone who had watched the adults in her life fail to be direct and had decided to be different. He thought about the question honestly. He thought about the apartment, small his exactly right. He thought about the project in the western suburbs that was going well. He thought about a baseball field in Iowa City and an office in Lincoln Park. He thought about Sunday phone calls and a father who had found the words. One October evening, he thought about what happiness was, not the uncomplicated version he might have described at 35, before all of it, but the more accurate version he understood now. The absence of waiting, the absence of needing things from people who weren't able to give them, the presence of a life that was genuinely, quietly his. "Yeah," he said, "I am." She looked at him for a moment longer, checking the way she always checked, and then she nodded. "Good," she said. She moved to go get her jacket. Then she stopped. She looked at him with the expression she had always had since she was a little girl, when she was about to say the true thing she'd been working toward the whole evening. "Dad," she said. He waited. "I've been thinking about what you said at the wedding, about the family, choosing the piece of the table over the person sitting at it." He waited. "I think about that a lot," she said. "And I want you to know. I know I didn't call you when I should have. In September, when they came to my apartment, I know I made a choice, and it was the wrong one. And I've thought about it a lot. Emma, I'm not asking you to. I'm not looking for anything. I just needed to say it." She paused. "And I need you to know that I know the difference now between the table and the person. I know which one I'm choosing." He looked at his daughter. He thought about everything that had made her, the years before, the years through, the years after, and how the makings had required more of her than it should have, and how she had been, through all of it, someone he would have chosen, even if choosing had been available to him. "I know," he said. "And for what it's worth," she said, picking up her jacket, moving toward the door with the easy efficiency of someone whose time was genuinely her own. She stopped. She looked at him. "You were the parent who stayed." She said it simply, not as consolation, not as performance, just as a true thing, being named by someone who had been there and had watched and knew. "Both of you were there for a while," she said. "But when it got hard, when it would have been easier to be somewhere else, to be someone else, you stayed with us. In the hard part, you stayed." She hugged him. He held on for a moment longer than he usually did. She left. He stood in his kitchen, after the door closed, in his apartment, in his life, in the specific quiet of a Saturday night in October, and he let himself feel what she'd said, not as validation. He'd stopped needing to be validated somewhere in the past 3 years, but as information, true information, the kind that landed, not in the chest, but somewhere deeper, in the place where the things you've done, and the reasons you did them, and the costs they carried, were stored, and occasionally, if rarely, confirmed. He stayed. He had stayed. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the years of carrying things that should have been shared, but through the staying, through the maintenance of a presence that could be counted on. When counting on something was what his children needed, he had been, when it mattered most, the one who was there. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to the window. The city was doing what it always did. Ongoing, indifferent, continuous. And he stood in the October dark and looked at it and felt for the first time in a long time. Nothing pressing, no weight to redistribute, no new arrangement required. Just the city, just the night, just a man who had been through something and had come out the other side, still himself, older, clearer, and with 2 kids. Who knew exactly who he was? That was enough. That was, he thought, more than enough.